Hello everyone, I wanted to make a new video on the mighty SM-1. If you've been following this channel for a little bit, you know that I have unconditional love for full voices. I love my Atlantis, I love the DFAM. I think these are amazing tools to make music, and they're especially immediate to play live with. So when the Cwejman SM-1 came up for sale, I couldn't resist. I absolutely didn't need it, given that I just bought the Atlantis like maybe 6 months prior. But when it comes to full voices, the SM-1 is kind of the end all of the full voices. So I've been wanting it forever. It's absolutely never for sale. It costs an arm and a leg. Let's be honest, it's way too much, but I haven't regretted it for 1 second. It's find its way in every of my track, every one of my loops, snippets, whatever you want to call it. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I think it's an amazing voice. Without further ado, let's dig into what the SM-1 is and everything we can do with it. So the most logical way to start this video would probably be to start with the panel tour. There's a lot to unpack here. As you can see, there's quite a few knobs. The good thing with this SM-1 is that even though it may seem daunting at first, it's quite logically laid out like most Cwejman module. You have sections basically which are highlighted on top. So there's a master section, 2 oscillators, the multimode filter, and the 2 envelopes. I also really like that all the CV outputs are lined at the bottom. Also some CV inputs and outputs here. All in all, it's a super logical module. Haters of make noise would probably love Cwejman. This demo will be sequenced by the Metropolis. I think these two pair really well. Metropolis, as everyone knows, is a mean techno sequence machine, and the SM-1 is a mean beast too. So if we start with the master section, we have a transpose knob, which is super useful, +3, -3. Honestly, I've never been that high, but I use -2, +1 usually a lot. There's the filter cutoff tracking. We'll dive into this when we go to the multimode filter. It's detended at the middle position, which means that here it will track 1 volt per octave. If you want to use the multimode filter as a sine wave oscillator, there's no problem for tracking here. You have a glide knob, which I found extremely useful and extremely musical. It's quite different from the slide you get from the Metropolis, which is really voiced like a 303 slide. This one is a glide, like more of a classic glide you'd find a synth. And I find it sounds really, really good, and I use it a lot of the time. You have 2 LFOs, which are, I think, exactly the same. They both go almost to audio rate if you turn the knob, but you can push them with the LFO rate input here, and then you get 2 fully tracking oscillators with all these different waveforms, so from square to random. There's also a smooth random, which I really like. You can, with the switch, activate the tracking or not, so either the LFO is free running or it follows the pitch information you send at the tune input, if you want to use them as oscillators or just have some sort of rhythm to your modulation. You have the sync input, which doesn't sync as in on the clock like you would sync a delay maybe, but more it resets. It's more of a reset. So every time you send a pulse to the sync input, the waveform of the LFO reset. So depending on the waveform you choose, it can act like an envelope or more like a, kind of a sync, but different. So interesting stuff. You can, of course, choose to have the oscillators free running or follow the tracking of the pitch, depending which one you use. It's fun, and also for FM, you can have super dissonant FM if you deactivate the tracking for the modulator. The oscillators are super similar. The only difference is the middle waveform, which on the first oscillator is noise, and here you have ring modulation, and with that switch you can choose whether it's oscillator 1 ring modulating oscillator 2, or if you are ring modulating with the external audio input. The other difference are the normalization here for the FM inputs. FM1 here is ADSR1, so extremely useful for percussive sounds, and FM2 is LFO1. Here there's sort of FM linked to FM2, which is VCO1, so it's super easy to turn this into a sort of complex oscillator without the wave folder, and the FM1 is ADSR2. The multimode section is, as you guessed, a multimode filter with all the modes laid out here. You have a sort of a modulation hub here where you can choose the amount of modulation. It's detended at the middle, so it goes up to 5 in each direction, and it's either LFO1, oscillator 1, or external cutoff 1, or LFO2. So depending on the way it goes, it's these destinations or these two. It can only be one at a time. So if you want two things modulating the filter, you have to use something like a triplet or a mixer or whatever to have both the LFO1, which you can tap here, and maybe an envelope or something else. The switches here are the resonance behavior, so either it's resonance or it turns into an oscillator if you put it here, so more like when you want to use it as a sine wave. You have a two-way switch for saturation 1 and 2, of course we'll hear that later, and you can choose 2-pole or 4-pole. Here, so resonance, the spacing, depending on the type of filter you have, there are different peaks, and you can choose the spacing of the peaks. For users who have a Belgrade by Chaos devices, that's quite similar, but most Cwejman modules have that spacing knob. It's really useful to pick and choose frequency you want to highlight. These two knobs are probably some of my favorites on the module. The ADSR knob applied to the filter, so positive in that way, negative in that way. ADSR1, ADSR2, both apply to the filter. So you have a lot of modulation available. Maybe when you saw this, you thought, oh, it's either just one LFO or oscillator 1 for FM or external cutoff. But you have this, you can choose. Both of the ADSR are linked to the filter, and you also have the filter tracking. So there's so many options just on the module without any external modulation or VCAs or attenuators to have movement with the filter. Then both envelopes, the second one can be linked to linear or exponential. This one is linked to the VCA. This one is usually linked to the filter. And you can have them both loop, but in a slightly different way that you might be used to. We'll dive into that with audio example, which are always more interesting than some blah, blah, blah about the panel. So I think we did most of the tour. There's a few switches we haven't talked about, like the sync input, which is pretty self-explanatory. Oscillator 2 syncs to oscillator 1. Here, the pulse width modulation, there's two switches. You can choose to have positive pulse width modulation, so it will only modulate the positive part of the waveform, or classic pulse width modulation, where it modulates both the positive and the negative part. I think in that way, with just the positive part, don't think I've seen that anywhere on any modules beside that one, or maybe some other Cwejman module. Is quite unique to this module. And then the oscillator here, there's a little arrow. You can choose to have the ADSR positive or negative. So it applies the ADSR positively to the pitch or negatively. So depending if you want a percussive sound or low toms or stuff like this. It's quite interesting. In that way, it can be very similar to the syncussion, where you also have a switch like this. So let's start with something maybe as boring as my panel overview, which is a sine wave without any filter on, and a slightly boring sequence, just to get the hang of the different waveforms. So we have a sine wave here, then your classic saw wave. This one I think I already don't know what it is. Then we have some noise. I always find it super interesting how every noise in every module had a different flavor. This one, not sure what it is. Pulse width. These three ones have pulse width modulation. They're a bit more harmonically rich and aggressive. And a saw wave, of course, Let's filter that a bit. And then with the pulse width modulation, which is linked to the LFO, you can hear the rich pulse wave. Of course, the sound cuts when it's too extreme, and you can push it to positive. So as you can hear, quite a drastic difference. I'm not a big user of pulse width modulation, but you gotta admit it sounds really good. Super low, super high, fine tune, coarse tune. So let's close the filter down a bit. You can bring the second oscillator, which as you can hear is not tuned at all. And then you can start to let magic happen with these envelopes. As you can hear, it can get quite percussive super quickly, especially if you close down the filter, it closes down completely. So if you like bongo-y, LPG style synth line, it's a very good filter for this. We're in 2-pole here, 4-pole, always a bit more gentle. As you can hear, even with no saturation engaged, the filter starts to saturate if you have a lot of volume. So you have to back up a little bit. It's natural behavior in most filters. But if you have all these two at 10 plus you engage the saturation is quite crazy. 2 is even crazier. If you like nasty and saturated, this is super nice. This is way too much for me, so usually if I use the saturation, I'll back this up a bit. And if you just one oscillator, you have a bit more leeway. Of course, that's entirely logical. You can hear the lower notes don't open the filter at all, while the higher notes do. If we boost the sequence, so we're still in low pass. Hear the difference. Such a huge difference. High pass. Sounds really good. Bend pass. You can have these two envelopes working against each other, and they can of course have super different settings. Band pass sounds very good. This one is probably my most used filter because it acts like a sort of a low pass in the first part of the knob travel and then turns into a high pass. And you have two peaks where you can choose and pick which harmonics get bumped. So you can really bump the low harmonics or the low end, and it's especially magic with the envelopes. It has a very sharp sound, which I really love. There's quite a world of sounds in between these four controls. That's without even talking about filter modulation, but just the envelopes and the filter tracking. Depending on the sequence and the effects you have and the sounds you choose and if there's FM or not, the filter tracking can have a huge impact to, like here, highlight that higher note and give a huge boost to that sequence, really. We are in linear envelope. You can go to exponential to have something exponential, a bit more aggressive. And as soon as you add effects, you get something really interesting going on. And then you can bring the cutoff, the LFO, which here is completely free running. You can see at 2 already has quite dramatic impact. I barely ever go further than 2 or 3. But if you kind of try to sync it by ear, somewhat in the, let's say it's not sync. You don't want it synced really, but somewhere. And you can bring the glide, which you'll hear is very musical. I'd say up to 6, it's still quite subtle. You can hear the wow. And if you pass 6, then you get into more like water slide territory. Which can still be super usable. So with the resonance and the peaks, you can really bump the low end, for example. And you can get this hybrid bass line and synth, which I really love. The effect here is a little bit of Sarajevo delay, which I love and I've been using in conjunction with the SM-1. And there's a little bit of ghost reverb, which against all odds I quite like. And there's also a bit of a DP4 reverb. You have the LFO outputs in case you wanna maybe just have the positive part of the LFO modulating the filter. You can always run that through an offset and bring it back to the external cutoff. You of course have CV inputs for spacing, resonance, external cutoff like I said, which will bypass this destination unless you mix them beforehand. Then everything has CV inputs basically. The little white squares are just the internal normalization you have. So like I said, this filter is the one I use maybe 75% of the time. This one is a bit similar, except maybe more voiced towards a high pass. Although you can get plenty of low end too. This one seems to be like a mirror version of that one. I seem to recall finding like a Facebook post by Cwejman where she was describing these filter modes. Maybe someone more enlightened than me in filter graphics can let me know what that is. All I know is that they sound really good. You can also self-patch. I like to self-patch the sustain or release to the LFO too. Again, you'll get the positive and negative part of the LFO. I think it's positive when the light is glowing and negative when it's not. But this is really a full voice in the truest sense of the term. You barely need anything to make it shine. I would say like an attenuator like this is still quite useful. Maybe if you want to have some more external modulation, that's what's here. You can bring in an envelope or something else, but you get two LFOs which are also random generators. You can inject noise in the filter if you want with the oscillator. You have two envelopes, so there's a lot of modulation already inbuilt. Only downside of the SM-1, and which truly makes it semi-modular and not modular, is that there's no outputs for the individual waveform. At least for oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, that would have been nice to separate them completely, use them completely different. This is really thought as a full voice, which you use as is. You can't really split it. You have the modulation, which is available separately, ADSR1, 2, which is quite useful. And I often use the LFOs, especially in live case like this where there's not a lot of modulation. I usually use all these to modulate other parameters. One thing we haven't mentioned yet is the loop of both envelope. So it's quite similar for both. You can see here there's a loop. I'll change my sequence for this. So you have to put the sustain in loop position, the switch here, and then what it does is as long as the gate is high, it will loop in between these two stages. Which is really nice to get some offbeat kind of thing. It reminds me a bit of the poly envelope by Verbose, where you can have this sort of nested polyrhythm off-grid kind of stuff, but it's still driven by a sequence, but you can have it loop at audio rate. It's on you to find the rhythm that works well. This is something that I've found quite useful. I've been using in a few of my loops and tracks, and it's a bit hard maybe to find the sweet spot live because it's quite sensitive. And what sounds good is really relative to a lot of different parameters. The BPM, your kick pattern, whatever else you have playing next. But it's a super cool feature. You can really do some nice shuffly sequence like this. And stuff like this is hard to do anywhere else. I think the Atlantis has a semi-similar feature, maybe similar, but there's a trig input that does, if you send triggers to the trig input, it will repeat the envelope as long as the gate is high. I haven't tried to match the two to see if it's exactly the same thing or not. But there's an idea like this, at least. You can really hear the glide here. It's a super simple sequence without any modulation, but with the envelope that's looping in a offbeat way, the LFO that's not related to anything, and then the manual modulation you can of course apply. It's kind of a world in itself, that filter. It's easy to just get lost tweaking slightly because the parameters are just locked in. It's just super. There's barely anywhere in the course of those spots that's not usable. Everywhere sounds good. Let's move to other kind of more bleepy patches, stuff that I really like to do with the SM-1 as well. Still using the Metropolis to sequence just a basic 8-step sequence with, I believe, 8 steps activated. This is the slide of the Metropolis, and this is the glide. So as you can hear, it's quite different. Of course, here you can choose by step, whereas here it's global. So you can use both in conjunction. So I really like to double the output of the Metropolis for this via triplet. I think this ×2 is really useful. I like just reducing the range a little bit then, just to put it out of the scale that you have to use in the Metropolis. But then, I mean, you can also not use the attenuator. I like these super high notes. They're really nice, especially when you add a bit of effects. But with the ×2, the nice thing is you can get this lower register notes, but also the super high. And I also like to bring some modulation. I think that's just an envelope from Pamela's new workout to the octave. So sometimes you will get even higher notes like this. This is a bit too low. You can't hear the low notes anymore. Maybe that's a good occasion to try the ring mod. So that's oscillator 2 ring modded by oscillator 1. Of course, if you change the waveform or the pitch, typically you'd use a sine wave. You will get a different sound. And you can also use, like I said, the external input. Let's use a static VCO1 from the DFAM. You can use triangle or square with different results, of course. But I mean, the onboard one is perfectly fine. It's really nice to have ring mod. You can easily do it if you have some bipolar VCAs or a combination of VCAs and attenuators like this, but it's really nice to have it on board, and I use it a lot in a Cwejman module. We can compare the sine wave from the oscillator to the sine wave of the multimode filter. The transpose input still works. And of course here the two envelopes are applied to the pitch because they apply to the cutoff, which is the pitch in that case. So you get super percussive sounds, or negative envelopes which are more like slidey. And you can get a combination of the two. Sort of like percussive and also bleepy, but you can just get So now that we've done a few bleeps with the sine wave and the filter and the oscillators, I want to also show how you can definitely create chords with the SM-1 using one LFO or two LFO. I just tuned one LFO here because you need mixers and attenuators to be able to perfectly control tuning and the mixing of the different voices, but you can, if you want, add a second LFO and have four voices, 4 notes chords. So let's bring our oscillator first with just saw wave. And the LFO. So what I've done is using this cable with an offset into the LFO rate to offset the tuning of the LFO, and then just have the volume here. You can mute. I'm using the filter output, so pre-VCA here, just to hear the chords, but we are going to change that into the post VCA and start the clock in our sequencer. So that's more or less a G chord, if I'm not wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm just so bad with the music theory, but at least one of the oscillators is more or less tuned to a G, the other to a B, the other to a D. I say more or less. So this is our filter fully opened, and you can have fun chords. Then you can choose different waveforms for a bit more grit. If you add the saturation here, it's going to be super extreme. So here, if you have the LFO, you of course have audio rate modulation of the filter. You can choose the LFO 1, oscillator 1. Lots of very subtle parameters you can get. You can bring FM to one of the voices, go all out with square waves. Here the oscillator is almost tuned where a full upward way is the length of the sequence. If you want, you can sync it. But you can get really interesting sequences, I think, with just a few. I mean, here we have, of course, a different voice, which does make a difference, especially in the lower register. Just be LFO by itself. This sounds as good as the oscillator. And since we are using the external audio input, another thing we can do is plug something completely unrelated into the input. And we can use, for example, the Noise Plethora, which is a completely digital module, and which I found pairs really nicely with the filter of the Cwejman SM-1. So here's the sequence with the noise plethora, just the noise plethora going in the SM-1. You can layer a bit of the oscillator if you want. Still loop stuff if you want. Anyway, there are 1,000 uses for the external audio input. It's just nice to have access to this filter and all the network of modulation that's built into the module, especially if you have digital modules like this. Although there's an analog filter, I still find that it hugely benefits from a different analog filter just after. So there you go, the long overdue demo of the Cwejman SM-1, the mighty voice by Cwejman. It's both incredibly immediate, incredibly powerful, and incredibly fun to use while being super deep in its options. For synthesis, you have ring modulation, FM. All the internal routings are really, really well laid out, and it's a joy to use. It's been in every of my tracks so far. Ever since I bought it, basically, it found its way in the track, whether it's the bass line, the synth, or everything at once, even sometimes tiny percussions, which I haven't showcased here, but it's really good at it because the envelopes are super sharp. This you've probably heard. So true, it's a kind of an Optinium module. They don't come for sale often, whether directly from Cwejman, Snyder's-Landen, or even secondhand. Secondhand, the prices are usually insane. Is it worth it? That's the big question. I mean, to me, it's worth it because I've been using it a lot. And anything that I use it a lot in, even if the price is not really reasonable, that's the price of the OB6 more or less. It's probably even more expensive than the OB6, which, if you think about it, doesn't really make sense for a module, but it's more than a module, it's just a full-fledged synth. And so far, I would say, given that this synth has led me to quite a few tracks, then it's worth it for me. But if not, you have a full sample pack, which I've done, and you can download from my Bandcamp at the usual price of €6. It's fun, it's a lot of loops like you just heard, with a bit more variety maybe. I find it usable, so yeah, if you're not really down for dropping that much cash on a module, then the samples are a good way to maybe scratch that Cwejman itch. And with all that said, I'll see you in the next one, hopefully soon, but you know as it is with those videos. Bye-bye.